She was the star of Club Euphoria, the woman every man wanted but none could claim. Sapphira Monet didn't just dance, she owned the stage, commanding attention with every move, every glance, every flick of her wrist. She was untouchable, a fantasy wrapped in beauty and confidence. But fantasies don't last forever. One man saw her as more than just a performer. To him, she was a prize, something to be won, possessed, controlled. He had the money, the power, and the kind of influence that made people look the other way. But Sapphira wasn't like the others. She didn't care about his gifts, his empty promises, or his dangerous charm. She told him no. And for that, she had to die. On a night that should have ended like any other, Sapphira stepped out of the club for the last time. What happened next was swift, brutal, and terrifying. A moment of rage. A pull of a trigger. A woman who refused to be owned, left bleeding on the pavement. But this wasn't just another tragic story. What unfolded in the aftermath would shake the city of Atlanta, exposing the dark truths about power, obsession, and the deadly consequences of telling the wrong man no. What happens when a man with wealth and influence believes he is above rejection? When entitlement turns violent, and the woman who dared to stand her ground becomes a target? Before we dive into this heartbreaking case, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more gripping tales of love, power, and deadly consequences. Sapphira Monet wasn't just a dancer, she was an experience. The moment she stepped onto the stage at Club Euphoria, the room changed. Eyes locked onto her, conversation stopped mid-sentence, and men, powerful, wealthy men, forgot about the world outside those velvet-draped walls. She moved with the kind of confidence that couldn't be faked, hypnotic rhythm that pulled people in and left them willing to spend thousands just for a moment of her attention. At 28, she was at the top of her game, the reigning queen of Atlanta's most exclusive strip club. Club Euphoria wasn't just any club, it was the club. A place where money rained like confetti, where celebrities and politicians sat in dark corners making deals over bottles of Cristal, where the right amount of cash could get you almost anything. Almost. Sapphira understood the game better than anyone. She played it flawlessly, knowing exactly how to give just enough without giving in. She wasn't some naive girl chasing fast money, she was business-minded, strategic. She knew her worth, and no man, no matter how rich or powerful, could buy her. Some tried, of course. They all did. They offered her diamonds, designer bags, flights to Dubai. They whispered promises of taking care of her, of making her life easy. But Sapphira had seen how that story ended too many times, girls who traded their independence for luxury, only to be discarded when the next one came along. That wasn't going to be her. She danced for the money, not for a man's control. And despite the nature of her career, Sapphira upheld strict personal boundaries. She refused to engage in sex work, no matter the price, no matter who was asking. It wasn't about judgment, it was about choice. Her body belonged to her, and no amount of money could change that. That stance frustrated many of Club Euphoria's high-profile clients. They weren't used to hearing no. In their world, everything had a price. They spent tens of thousands in the club, expecting something in return, something more than a dance, more than a fantasy. And when Sapphira denied them, some took it as a challenge. Others took it as an insult. She had seen the signs before, the men who got too attached, who didn't like rejection. But she was careful. She set boundaries, she didn't mix business with pleasure, and she always kept an eye on the ones who lingered a little too long, spent a little too much, got a little too obsessed. Because in a place like Club Euphoria, where money could buy almost anything, some men refused to accept that she wasn't for sale. Nehemiah Nico Barrington was a man who built his empire on power, money, and fear. At 41 years old, he was one of the most influential music executives in Atlanta, one of those men who didn't just move through the industry but controlled it. If you were an artist trying to make it big, you wanted Nico in your corner. But if you crossed him, if you got on his bad side, well, people had a way of disappearing when that happened. Whispers followed him everywhere. The luxury cars, the multi-million-dollar properties, the endless stream of models and socialites clinging to his arm, it all looked glamorous on the surface. But those who knew the real Nico knew better. Money wasn't the only thing fueling his empire. There were rumors of drug trafficking, extortion, even bodies buried under the weight of his success. He was the kind of man who bought loyalty with fear, the kind of man who never had to ask twice. And yet, for all his power, for all the women who threw themselves at him without hesitation, there was one who refused to be owned. Sapphira Monet. Nico first saw her months before, and from that moment, she became his newest obsession. She wasn't like the others. She didn't fawn over his wealth, didn't melt under the pressure of his presence. She danced for him, sure, just like she danced for everyone else in Club Euphoria, but there was a distance in her eyes, a quiet defiance that made it clear, she wasn't for sale. That only made him want her more. Nico wasn't a man used to rejection. He was used to snapping his fingers and having the world at his feet. So when Sapphira brushed off his advances, he didn't walk away, he doubled down. He sent her gifts so extravagant they made the other dancers jealous, diamond bracelets, designer handbags, wads of cash delivered in sleek black envelopes. He offered her weekends in Paris, private jet rides to Dubai, penthouses with her name on the lease. All she had to do was say yes. But Sapphira didn't want his gifts. She didn't want his money. She didn't want him. She turned him down every time. At first, Nico played it cool. He laughed it off, told himself she was just playing hard to get. But as the months passed and her refusals continued, that laughter faded. His patience wore thin. Sapphira wasn't rejecting just any man. She was rejecting him. And that wasn't something Nico Barrington tolerated. The more she pulled away, the harder he pushed. The private invitations turned into demands. The charming smiles turned into clenched jaws. The compliments became warnings. And then, one night, in the middle of a packed Club Euphoria, she embarrassed him. Right there, in front of his entourage, his business associates, and a club full of people who feared and respected him, she rejected him publicly. He had reached for her, expecting her to finally give in. But instead, she pulled back. She smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was dismissive. When she walked past him without a second glance, his crew laughed, and something in him snapped. His ego was too big for rejection. Too powerful for humiliation. That night, he left the club with a decision made. If Sapphira wouldn't accept him willingly, she wouldn't have a choice. Then came the night of her murder. The night was electric. Club Euphoria pulsed with life, the bass shaking the walls as hundreds of high-rolling patrons threw money like it was nothing. This was Sapphira Monet's stage, her kingdom, and tonight, like every night, she reigned supreme. Dressed in shimmering sapphire blue, her signature color, she moved with effortless grace, commanding the crowd's attention. Men worshipped her. They fought for her time, begged for a moment in her presence. But no matter how much money rained down, no matter how many VIPs lined up for private dances, Sapphira remained untouchable. She played the game well, she knew how to tease, how to seduce, how to make men believe they had a chance. But at the end of the night, she belonged to no one. Except tonight, someone wasn't just watching. Someone wasn't just admiring. Nico Barrington sat in his usual section, draped in gold and surrounded by his crew. He'd spent over $50,000 that night, his way of proving a point, showing the world, showing her that he was a man who got what he wanted. And yet, despite the obscene amount of money he threw, despite the way the other girls in the club flocked to him, Sapphira hadn't spared him more than a passing glance. Nico was drunk. Not just on the liquor but on his own entitlement, his own fury. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. She was supposed to understand by now. She was supposed to come to him willingly, to finally accept that she belonged to him. And yet, As her final set ended, as she gathered her things and prepared to leave, she still treated him like every other desperate man who thought he had a chance. He couldn't let that slide. He moved toward her, weaving through the club like a predator closing in on its prey. She barely reacted when he stepped into her space, as if his presence was nothing more than an inconvenience. Then he leaned in, whispered something in her ear. What he said, no one knows for sure. Some say it was a promise, one last chance to accept his offer. Others say it was a threat. Whatever it was, Sapphira's response was the same as always. She pulled away, shook her head, and turned her back on him. That was it. That was the moment that sealed her fate. When she rejected him again, that was the moment Nico snapped. She didn't see the way his jaw clenched, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides. She didn't see the darkness creep into his eyes, the decision harden in his mind. But as she made her way to the parking lot, alone, she would soon feel it. The night air was thick, humid, wrapping around her like a second skin. Sapphira moved quickly, her heels clicking against the pavement, eager to leave the club behind. She never made it to her car. The first shot rang out so suddenly, so violently, that for a split second, the world seemed to freeze. The bullet tore into her back, shattering her shoulder blade, sending her crashing onto the pavement. Pain flooded her body, stealing the air from her lungs, but instinct took over. She tried to crawl, tried to move, tried to get away. A second shot. This time, it hit lower, her spine snapping like a twig beneath the force of the bullet. A strangled cry escaped her lips as her legs gave out beneath her. She could still feel everything, her heart pounding in terror, the pavement cold beneath her fingers, but her body refused to respond. Paralyzed. She was still alive. Still aware. Then, footsteps. Slow. Unhurried. Nico stood over her, looking down at the woman who had dared to defy him one too many times. Witnesses say there was no hesitation. No second thoughts. He raised the gun one last time, aimed it between her eyes, and pulled the trigger. The final shot echoed through the night. The gunshots shattered the night. A scream ripped through the air, high-pitched, desperate, then suddenly cut off. A moment of stunned silence fell over the parking lot before chaos erupted. Inside Club Euphoria, the music still pulsed, oblivious to the horror unfolding just outside its doors. But then the first scream reached the walls. The DJ hesitated, the bass faltered, and a woman burst in, her face pale with shock. He shot her. A ripple of panic spread through the club like wildfire. Patrons stumbled from their booths, drinks crashing to the floor. Dancers froze mid-performance. Bouncers, momentarily stunned, exchanged glances before surging toward the exit. By the time they reached the lot, it was too late. Sapphira Monet lay motionless on the pavement, her body twisted where she had fallen. Blood pooled beneath her, dark and glistening under the club's neon glow. The air smelled of gunpowder, hot pavement, and something metallic, something final. Nico Barrington stood over her, his chest rising and falling with each deep breath. The gun dangled from his fingers, still warm, still smoking. But his face, it was eerily calm. No panic, no regret. Just a cold satisfaction. "Call 911, someone yelled. The bouncers hesitated. This was Nico Barrington. A man who had paid for their loyalty many times over. A man with the kind of power that could erase problems, and people, without a second thought. The club owner appeared at the door, eyes darting between Nico and Sapphira's lifeless body. His mind worked fast. This wasn't just any shooting. This was a scandal. A murder at his club. If the police got involved, Club Euphoria would never recover. "Get him out of here," he ordered, voice low, urgent. One of Nico's men stepped forward, ready to lead him out the back. But before they could move, red and blue lights flooded the parking lot. Atlanta PD had already arrived. Nico barely flinched as officers rushed forward, guns drawn, voices barking orders. He turned slowly, his gaze cool, his expression unreadable. As if this was just another minor inconvenience. Hands up. On the ground. For the first time in his life, Nico did what he was told. He raised his hands, dropped to his knees, and let them take him. Blood smeared against the fabric of his $1,000 suit. Sapphira's blood. He didn't bother looking down. As they cuffed him, pressing his face into the pavement, a smirk flickered across his lips. They didn't understand. This wasn't the end of Nico Barrington. Money had saved him before. And in his mind, it would save him again. The day of the trial, the courtroom was a pressure cooker of tension, anticipation, and raw emotion. The gallery was packed with reporters, legal analysts, and members of the public who had followed every detail of the case. Some were there for justice, others for spectacle. But at the center of it all, sitting stone-faced in the front row, was Sapphira Monet, Sapphira's mother. She had spent the past year fighting. Fighting to make sure her daughter wasn't forgotten. Fighting to keep Nico Barrington from using his money and influence to manipulate the system. This wasn't just a trial, it was a war, and she refused to let her daughter's killer walk free. Then, the defendant entered. Nico Barrington, once a towering figure in the music industry, now shuffled into the courtroom in shackles, his orange prison jumpsuit a stark contrast to the custom-tailored suits he once wore. Even in chains, there was an air of entitlement about him, a smirk that never quite left his lips. To him, this was just another inconvenience, another situation his money could fix. He had paid his way out of trouble before. Why should this be any different? But as the prosecution began, it became clear that this wasn't a scandal that could be swept under the rug. This was murder. Cold-blooded, deliberate, and caught on tape. The lead prosecutor wasted no time painting Nico as a man who believed he was above consequences. They laid out the months of obsession, the expensive gifts Sapphira rejected, the rage that built every time she told him no. Witnesses took the stand, including fellow dancers from Club Euphoria, who described Nico's escalating aggression, his entitlement, the way he seethed whenever Sapphira turned him down. Then came the security footage. The room fell silent as the jury watched the final moments of Sapphira Monet's life. She was walking to her car, heels clicking against the pavement. Nico followed. Words were exchanged. She shook her head, dismissing him one last time. Then, 3 shots. The first one struck her back, the second shattered her spine. She collapsed onto the pavement, paralyzed but conscious. And as she struggled, Nico stepped closer, took his time, and delivered the final shot to her forehead. The video ended. A heavy silence blanketed the courtroom. Nico had leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his smirk barely fading. But if the prosecution had been ruthless, the defense was even more vicious. They spun a narrative of a woman who played the game. They called in so-called character witnesses to testify that Sapphira had led Nico on, that she had taken his money, his gifts, his attention, only to humiliate him in the end. They painted her as a gold digger, a woman who had used her beauty to exploit men, only to push too far. The implication was clear, she should have known better. But Sapphira Monet knew better than anyone that her daughter wasn't someone's plaything. Sapphira had built her own life, lived on her own terms. She danced for the money, not for a man's control. She had every right to say no. And no one had the right to kill her for it. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours. When they returned, the air was thick with anticipation. The judge asked the foreperson for the verdict. Guilty. A sharp cry rang out from the back of the courtroom, one of Nico's remaining supporters, perhaps a former business associate still clinging to the illusion of his power. But Nico himself sat still, jaw tight, his smirk finally gone. He had been found guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was swift, life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the first time, Nico Barrington looked shaken. He turned his head toward the gallery, perhaps searching for someone, an ally, an escape, a way out. But there was nothing. Just the reality that his money, his status, his name, none of it could save him now. Across the courtroom, Janica Monet exhaled. Not in relief, because nothing about this was satisfying. Her daughter was still gone. No amount of prison time would bring Sapphira back. But justice had been served. And in a world where men like Nico Barrington too often got away with everything, that was something. Sapphira's funeral was a spectacle of grief and defiance. Women who had danced beside her at Club Euphoria, celebrities who had once thrown thousands at her feet, activists who had never met her but felt her struggle deep in their bones, they all showed up. Black women in the sex industry, dancers, escorts, bottle girls, even cam models, began speaking out about the dangers they faced. About the men who felt entitled to their bodies, about the threats they received when they dared to say no. Sapphira had been one of the best, the most untouchable. And if it could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. Rappers who once boasted about spending racks at strip clubs were now being called out for the way they treated the women who entertained them. Club Euphoria shut down indefinitely, tainted by the blood spilled in its parking lot. Lawsuits were filed. Politicians who had once turned a blind eye were forced to acknowledge the silent epidemic of violence against black women in nightlife. And Nico Barrington? His money and influence had failed him. He sat in a prison cell, forgotten. A man who once controlled the careers of artists now had no control over his own life. The music industry had distanced itself from him, his name erased from credits and contracts. His legacy was no longer platinum records and industry deals, it was the cold-blooded murder of a woman who had dared to defy him. Sapphira Monet never wanted to be a martyr. She never asked to be a symbol. She had only wanted to dance, to make her money, to live on her own terms. But in death, she had become something greater, she had become a movement. But the question remains, how many more? How many more women will lose their lives to men who see rejection as an insult, as a challenge to be answered with violence? How do we protect women who dare to say no? What can be done to stop powerful men from using their status as a weapon? Sapphira's story isn't just a tragedy. It's a warning. And it's up to us to make sure it doesn't happen again. If this story moved you, like this video and subscribe for more cases that reveal the dark truths behind power, obsession, and deadly entitlement.